It was the kind of cold that makes your nostrils stick together the second you step outside, and I was already having the worst Tuesday of my adult life when I found the bright orange notice taped to my front door at 7 in the morning. Not tucked under the windshield wiper, not slipped into my mailbox like a normal piece of mail. No, this notice was taped directly to my door with about 4 strips of packing tape. The kind of overkill that makes you realize whoever put it there had really, truly committed to the act. I was still holding my first cup of coffee, standing on my front porch in my boots and heavy coat, watching my breath cloud in front of my face while the thermometer on the porch read 9 degrees Fahrenheit. 9. The snow from the previous weekend had packed down into a solid layer of ice in the driveway, the kind that laughs at rock salt and says not today. My outdoor water line that feeds the spigot on the back patio ran along the outside of the house for about 6 feet before it connected inside, and 2 winters ago I'd had it freeze and burst in a spot that cost me almost $2,000 to repair. So last fall I had done the responsible thing. I had wrapped that exposed section with self-regulating heat tape, covered the whole thing with foam pipe insulation, and then wrapped it with a layer of waterproof, UV-resistant insulation wrap that was sold specifically for outdoor pipe protection. It was gray. It was tidy. You practically had to walk around to the back of the house and crouch down to see it at all. The notice told me, in very official-looking bold print, that my outdoor heated water line wrap was not an approved material under the Maplecrest Heights Homeowners Association guidelines for exterior modifications and aesthetics, and that I had 14 days to remove it and bring my property into compliance or face a daily fine of $50 starting on day 15. The notice was signed by Vicki Ridgeway, Aesthetic Standards Compliance Coordinator, Maplecrest Heights HOA. I stood there in the 9-degree cold for a solid 30 seconds, just reading the title she had given herself, Aesthetic Standards Compliance Coordinator. I had never seen that title on any HOA document I had ever received. I had lived in Maplecrest Heights for 4 years and served on exactly 0 HOA committees because I valued my sanity, but I had read the documents. I had the CC&Rs in a folder in my filing cabinet, and I was reasonably certain that title did not exist anywhere in those pages. I went inside, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and started reading. Let me back up and tell you about Vicki Ridgeway, because you need the full picture to understand why that orange notice made my eye twitch like it did. Vicki had moved into the neighborhood about 2 years after I did. She had the corner house with the immaculate lawn, the kind of place where the mulch is always freshly laid even in January, which honestly should have been the first sign that something was off. She had joined the HOA board within about 3 months of moving in, which is the residential equivalent of transferring to a new school and immediately trying to run for class president before you even know where the bathrooms are. By her first full year on the board, she was chairing 2 committees. By her second year, she had somehow created a 3rd committee and made herself the chair of that one too. She had the look of someone who had watched one too many home improvement shows and decided that gave her authority over other people's choices. She wore a puffy vest even in mild weather, carried a clipboard everywhere she went outside, and had a habit of walking slowly past houses on the street in a way that was not quite walking and not quite inspecting, but landed somewhere uncomfortable in between. My neighbor Dave Kowalski, who had lived in Maplecrest Heights for 12 years and remembered what it was like before Vicki, described her as a woman who had mistaken a homeowners association for a small government and herself for its president, attorney general, and Supreme Court, all rolled into one. Dave was not wrong. I had a history with Vicki that was mostly minor but consistently annoying. She had sent me a notice about my mailbox flag being bent at the wrong angle. She had sent a notice about the color of my porch furniture cushions, claiming the coral shade was not on the approved color palette, which was insane because my porch faced the backyard and was not visible from the street. She had sent a notice about the length of my driveway extension mat, which I used in winter to keep the path from the car to the door clear, claiming it exceeded permitted dimensions by several inches. Every single one of those notices had either been withdrawn when I pushed back with the actual text of the governing documents, or had been quietly dropped when I made clear I was paying attention. But this pipe wrap situation was different, and I knew it the second I started reading the CC&Rs that morning with fresh eyes and fresh coffee. The CC&Rs, which are the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that every homeowner in Maplecrest Heights agreed to when they bought their house, contained a section on exterior modifications. It was Section 7, specifically 7.2, and it dealt with materials visible from the street. The key phrase was visible from the street. The language was specific. It said modifications to the exterior of the home that are visible from the public street or from an adjacent neighbor's primary viewing area required pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee. My pipe wrap was on the back of the house. It was not visible from the street. It was not visible from any neighbor's primary viewing area unless they were specifically walking around my backyard, which they were not authorized to do. It was a 6-foot section of gray foam, and wrap on a back exterior wall that basically looked like a pipe was wearing a small coat, which it was, because it was 9 degrees outside and the pipe needed a coat. I also noticed, reading carefully through the document, that there was absolutely no mention anywhere of an aesthetic standards compliance coordinator. There was a 3-person architectural review committee, there was a board of directors, and there were several standing committees, none of which bore that name or anything resembling it. Vicki Ridgeway had signed the notice with a title that did not exist. She had not signed it as a board member, which she technically was. She had signed it with a fabricated title that made her sound like she had specific authority she did not actually have. That was interesting. I took photos of the notice. I took photos of the pipe wrap itself, documenting exactly where it was located on the house and the fact that it faced the backyard. I measured the distance from the sidewalk in front of my house to the location of the pipe wrap, which came out to just under 90 feet with the house in between. I pulled out my phone and opened the HOA's own website, where they had posted the CC&Rs and bylaws, and I screenshotted every relevant page. Then I called my neighbor Linda Foss, who was a retired paralegal and knew more about HOA law than most practicing attorneys, because she had actually dealt with several HOA disputes in her career, and had continued to follow developments in the field as a hobby, which is either deeply fascinating or a little concerning depending on how you look at it. Linda answered on the second ring, and I could hear the weather report playing in her background. "Matt, I saw the orange notice on your door this morning." "From Vicki. How did you already know?" "Because she put one on Randy and Carol's door too, and I saw her doing it at 6:15 this morning from my kitchen window." She had on the puffy vest and a headlamp, Matt. A headlamp. She was out here in the dark in the 9-degree cold putting violation notices on people's doors with a headlamp on. I processed that for a moment. What did she cite Randy and Carol for? Their heated bird bath. She's claiming it's an unapproved electrical fixture modification. Their heated bird bath, which is on their back deck, which is completely enclosed by their privacy fence. Something was clicking together in my brain. "Linda, this is the second winter in a row she's done something like this. Last February she went after Dave for his roof heating cables, which are standard equipment in a cold climate and explicitly not covered by the CC&Rs, Linda said, already on the same page. "Matt, I think she's working an angle here. You know the board is up for election in March, right? The annual meeting is on the 15th. I had not been tracking that, but now I was. She does this every winter," Linda continued. "She ramps up the violations in January and February, creates a bunch of noise about property values and community standards, and then rides that wave into the spring election. It keeps her on the board, it keeps her committees running, and frankly, I think she enjoys it." "Well, this time she cited me for something that isn't actually a violation," I said. No, she cited you for something using a title she invented, Linda corrected me. There's a difference and it matters. Linda walked me through what she knew about HOA enforcement authority in our state, which was quite a lot. In our state, HOA notices had to come from a duly authorized officer or agent of the HOA as established by the governing documents. A notice issued by someone using a title that did not exist in the governing documents was not a valid notice, full stop. It didn't matter what the underlying complaint was or whether the complaint had any merit. The process had to be followed correctly. If Vicki had issued this notice acting outside her actual authority, the notice was void. There was also the question of what she was actually citing me for. Even if you set aside the fabricated title problem, the location of my pipe wrap meant Section 7.2 did not apply. And more than that, Linda pointed out something I hadn't considered. Forcing a homeowner to remove weather protection from their plumbing during winter conditions that had already been established as extreme enough to cause pipe damage could potentially create a duty of care issue for the HOA if the pipes then froze and caused property damage. Keep that in your back pocket, Linda told me. You probably won't need it, but keep it. I decided my first move was going to be simple and professional. I would write a response letter to the HOA board, not to Vicki personally, addressing it to the full board, and I would lay out exactly why the notice was procedurally invalid and substantively incorrect. I would be polite. I would cite the actual document sections. And I would give them 5 business days to formally withdraw the notice before I escalated. I sat down at my kitchen table with the heat running, and the snow still packed against the back wall where my pipe wore its little gray coat, and I wrote that letter. While I was writing, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Randy Carmichael next door. He had read the notice Vicki left him about the bird bath. He was not happy. Randy was a big, easygoing guy who had literally never said an unkind word about anybody in the 4 years I'd known him. So when Randy was not happy about something, you knew the something was genuinely over the line. I told him what Linda and I had discussed, and he asked if he could come over. 20 minutes later, he was sitting at my kitchen table too, and then Linda walked over because she lived 2 doors down and the cold wasn't going to stop her. And then Dave Kowalski came because Randy had texted him. And suddenly, I had a small council of neighbors sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee and looking at copies of the CC&Rs spread across my table. It turned out Dave had also received a notice that morning. His was about his propane tank cover, a simple wooden enclosure he had built around the tank to protect it from snow and ice accumulation, which in our region of the country was extremely common and had literally been there for 3 years without anyone saying anything. Now suddenly, it was a violation of an unapproved exterior structure rule. 3 notices, all delivered at 6:15 in the morning in the dark by a woman wearing a headlamp, all signed with the same fabricated title, all involving winter protection equipment that had been in place without complaint for significant periods of time. Linda was already on her laptop. "I'm pulling the board meeting minutes from the last 12 months, she said. "Let's see if this aesthetic standards compliance coordinator position was ever formally created and approved by the board." She found 12 months of meeting minutes on the HOA website. The position did not appear in any of them. It had never been voted on, never been formally established, and never been mentioned. Vicki had apparently just one day started signing things with that title and nobody had called her on it. Dave leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. "She's been signing notices with a fake title for how long? At least since October, based on the dates on these letters," Linda said. "I'm going to check back further." She went back to the previous year's minutes. Nothing. Randy crossed his arms. "So she's been impersonating an HOA official." "She is an HOA official," Linda said carefully. "She's on the board. But she's been representing herself as holding a specific position of authority that she was never granted. In HOA law, that's a meaningful distinction because it affects whether the actions she took in that capacity are binding or void. What does that mean practically? Randy asked. It means every notice she sent signed with that fake title might be void, and it might mean the fines she's collected based on those notices could need to be refunded. The kitchen got a little quieter for a moment as we all processed that. How many notices do you think she sent with that title? I asked. Based on what I know just from this street, Linda said, at least 8 in the last 6 months. And I only know about the ones people mentioned to me. After the impromptu kitchen meeting broke up, each of us went home, and I finished my letter to the board. I sent it by email to every board member whose email was listed on the HOA website, and I sent a physical copy by certified mail to the HOA's registered mailing address. My letter outlined the procedural invalidity of the notice due to the unrecognized title, cited Section 7.2, and explained why my pipe wrap did not fall within its scope, noted that I had documented evidence of the location, and confirmed it was not visible from the street, and requested written confirmation of the notice's withdrawal within 5 business days. I attached photos. I attached the relevant CC&R sections with the key language highlighted. I attached a screenshot from the HOA's own website showing the board roster and committee structure, which made absolutely no mention of any aesthetic standards compliance coordinator. I sent it at 2 in the afternoon. By 4 in the afternoon, I had a response, and not the one I expected. Vicki Ridgeway replied directly to me from her personal email, not the HOA address. Her reply did not acknowledge any of my points. It did not reference the governing documents. It told me that the HOA reserved the right to update and enforce community standards at any time, that my pipe wrap created an eyesore that would affect property values, and that she had received multiple complaints from neighbors. I read the part about multiple neighbor complaints twice. Those neighbors she was referencing were sitting in my kitchen 2 hours ago, eating my granola bars, and nodding in agreement that Vicki was out of line. The idea that any of my immediate neighbors had complained to her about my pipe wrap was laughable. My pipe wrap was on the back of my house. The only view of it was from my own backyard. I saved her email. Then I replied briefly, and only to clarify one thing. I asked her to provide me with the names of the complaining neighbors, or if she preferred to maintain their privacy, at least confirm the nature of the complaints and when they were received. I also asked her to clarify, for the record, under what provision of the governing documents the position of Aesthetic Standards Compliance Coordinator had been created, and by what vote. She did not reply to that. The 5 business days I had given the board ticked by slowly. The weather got worse before it got better, which in January usually means it got worse for a while, and then marginally worse than that. We had another 4 inches of snow midweek, the kind of heavy, wet snow that piles up on tree branches and makes them droop and crack, and the roads in our neighborhood got genuinely treacherous for a day and a half before the plowing crew got through. My pipe wrap did exactly what it was supposed to do. My backwater line stayed thawed and functional, while several of my other neighbors who had not wrapped their exposed lines dealt with varying degrees of freeze-up issues. During those 5 days, I also talked to more neighbors than I had in the previous 6 months, because word had gotten around about the headlamp notices. There were 12 homes in Maplecrest Heights who had received some kind of notice from Vicki in the last 6 months signed with the Aesthetic Standards Compliance Coordinator title. I know that because I started asking around and people started talking, and the more they talked, the more clearly a pattern emerged. Vicki had been targeting homes with winter equipment specifically: heat tape on roof lines, heated bird baths, propane tank covers, temporary windbreak fencing, generator hookup covers. My pipe wrap, every single notice was aimed at something that homeowners used to manage winter conditions, and every single notice was signed with a title she had made up. The fines she had levied under this invented authority in the past 6 months totaled, across all 12 households, a combined amount of just over $4,000. Most people had paid because they didn't know to question it. They saw a notice from the HOA and assumed it was legitimate. That was an important number. $4,000 collected under potentially fraudulent authority. That was no longer a neighborhood dispute. That was starting to look like something that warranted a closer look from people with actual legal authority. On the fourth of my 5 business days, I got a call from one of the other board members, a man named Gerald Park who had been on the board for about 8 years and had always struck me as one of the genuinely reasonable ones. Gerald called me on my cell phone, not through any official channel, and he sounded tired. "Matt, I got your letter," he said. "I want you to know the full board has reviewed it. There's going to be a special meeting on Friday evening to discuss some concerns about procedure." "That's good to hear, Gerald. I want to be transparent with you. There are 3 of us on the board who were not aware of the enforcement actions Vicki had been taking under that title. I personally was not aware she was signing notices that way. We thought she was signing as a board member. How many notices has she signed with that title total?" A pause. "We're still compiling that. It's more than any of us were aware of. Gerald, there are homeowners who paid fines based on those notices. That money was collected under a title that was never authorized by the board. You understand what I'm suggesting?" "I do understand," he said quietly. "That's part of what the Friday meeting is going to address." I appreciated Gerald's call. It told me the board was not uniformly behind Vicki, and that at least some of them were alarmed by what they were finding out. But I also wasn't going to sit back and assume the meeting would go the right way on its own. I spent Thursday evening putting together a comprehensive document package. I had the 12 violation notices, all signed with the fake title. I had the 4 years of board meeting minutes showing the title never being created. I had a breakdown of the fines collected. I had statements from 5 of the 12 affected homeowners, written and signed, describing the notices they received and the payments they made. Linda helped me structure it properly, citing the relevant sections of our state's HOA regulations, as well as the specific governing document provisions. I also, on Linda's strong suggestion, consulted briefly by phone with an actual HOA attorney named Sheila Tran who worked in our metro area. Sheila charged me $150 for a 30-minute consultation and told me 3 things I needed to hear. First, the notices issued under the unauthorized title were almost certainly void, and any fines collected based on them were almost certainly recoverable. Second, the deliberate collection of fines under a fabricated position of authority could potentially constitute fraud or theft by deception under state law depending on intent, which was something law enforcement could investigate. Third, I should bring all of my documentation to the HOA meeting and get everything on the record. Sheila also mentioned, almost casually, that our state had specific statutory protections for homeowners against HOA overreach, including a provision that allowed homeowners to recover attorney fees from the HOA if they prevailed in a dispute. She told me to make sure the board was aware of that provision. Friday came with another cold snap, the temperature dropping to 4 degrees overnight and staying below 20 for most of the day. The kind of cold that makes your car groan when you start it and makes all outdoor activity feel vaguely punitive. The HOA special meeting was at 7 in the evening in the community room of the neighborhood's small recreation center, a single-story building with a parking lot that was a sheet of ice and an interior that smelled like the coffee they always made for these meetings. I got there 15 minutes early. I had my document package in a folder. Linda was with me. Randy and Carol came, and so did Dave, and so did 7 of the other 12 homeowners who had received invalid notices. That was 9 of us sitting in folding chairs in a room that was usually attended by maybe 6 people at a standard meeting, and the board members who arrived first clearly noticed the unusual turnout. Gerald nodded at me when he came in. He looked like he hadn't slept well. Vicki arrived last, 2 minutes after the scheduled start time, still in the puffy vest, still carrying a clipboard. She looked at the room and her expression flickered for just a moment before settling back into its usual controlled pleasantness. She sat at the board table, set down her clipboard, and folded her hands. Gerald called the meeting to order and immediately stated that the purpose of the special meeting was to review enforcement actions taken under the title Aesthetic Standards Compliance Coordinator and to address concerns raised by multiple homeowners. He was professional and careful with his words. Vicki immediately interrupted to say that the enforcement actions were routine exercises of Community Standards Authority and that she was fully authorized to take them. Gerald asked her to please allow him to finish his opening statement. She did not look pleased about that, but she stopped talking. Gerald laid out the board's findings clearly and thoroughly. The title Aesthetic Standards Compliance Coordinator did not appear in the governing documents. It had not been created or authorized by any board vote at any meeting in the recorded history of the HOA. The notices issued under that title were therefore not issued by a duly authorized representative of the HOA in the capacity claimed. The fines collected based on those notices had been collected under at least questionable authority. The board had suspended further enforcement actions under that title pending resolution of these concerns. Then I was given the floor. I stood up and I kept it simple and direct. I walked through my own situation first. The pipe wrap, the location, the fact that it was not visible from the street, the way Section 7.2 had been misapplied. I showed the photos. I showed the measurements. I explained why the notice was substantively wrong, in addition to being procedurally invalid. Then, I handed out copies of the compiled document package to each board member and to everyone in the room. I walked through the 12 notices. I showed the pattern. I noted the total fines collected. I read aloud the relevant section of our state HOA statute that governed proper authority for enforcement actions. I mentioned, carefully but clearly, that the deliberate collection of fees under a fabricated title could be viewed as something more serious than a procedural error, and that I had spoken with an HOA attorney who confirmed the recoverable nature of the fines and the possibility of individual homeowners pursuing claims. The room was very quiet. Vicki spoke then. Her voice was steady but tighter than usual. She said the title was an informal designation used to clarify her role in the committee structure. She said the board had been aware of her work in this area. She said the enforcement actions were in good faith. Gerald asked her directly, and on the record, whether she had ever sought board approval for the title or for the enforcement program she had been running under it. A pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. The board was aware of my work, she said again. Were you specifically authorized to collect fines under that title? Gerald pressed. Another pause. I was acting in the interest of community standards. One of the other board members, a woman named Patricia, said quietly that she had not been aware of the full scope of the enforcement program, and that she had understood Vicki's role to be advisory and reporting, not direct fine collection. Vicki started to say something about how the board had always trusted her judgment in these matters, and Dave Kowalski, who had been completely silent until this moment, said from his seat in a conversational tone, "Vicki, 3 years ago you signed a notice that my neighbor paid $200 in fines on. My neighbor who moved away last spring. You never issued that fine as a board member. You issued it as an aesthetic standards compliance coordinator. Where did that money go?" The room shifted. Gerald said the board would need to conduct a full audit of all fines collected under that title and reconcile them against the HOA's financial records. He said this in a very flat, careful tone. Vicki said the fines had gone into the HOA general fund, same as all fines. Linda, sitting next to me, leaned slightly forward. "Has the board verified that?" Gerald said the audit would determine that. The meeting ran for another hour and 20 minutes. By the end of it, the board had formally voted, with Vicki not participating and actually recusing herself partway through, on 3 things. 1. All notices issued under the Aesthetic Standards Compliance Coordinator title were formally declared void and without effect. 2. A full financial audit would be conducted of all fines collected under that title going back to its first use. 3. All affected homeowners would receive written notification of the voidance and information about the refund process. My notice was gone, officially, on the record, in front of a room full of witnesses. When we were walking out of the community room into the brutal cold of the parking lot, Dave stopped and looked up at the sky for a moment and said, "I've been waiting 3 years for that." I drove home with my heat cranked all the way up and watched the temperature gauge on my dashboard read 7 degrees outside, while everything inside the car was warm and my pipe at home was wrapped and functional. I felt good. Not vindicated exactly, because vindicated implies you needed to be, and I always knew I was right. Just good. Like something that had been leaning slightly wrong was now standing straight. But the story wasn't quite finished, because the audit happened, and it turned out to be more complicated than anyone expected. The HOA's accounting firm was brought in 3 weeks after the meeting, and Linda kept me updated through her HOA contacts, because she had become extremely invested in the outcome. The audit took about 3 weeks and covered 18 months of records rather than just the 6 I had documented, because once they started looking they needed to look at the full picture. The results were not good for Vicki. The audit found that over 18 months, Vicki had collected a total of $11,400 in fines under the unauthorized title. Of that amount, $9,200 had been properly deposited into the HOA General Fund. The remaining $2,200 had passed through a separate account that was not an official HOA account. It was an account in the name of the Maplecrest Heights Community Improvement Fund, which sounded official, but was not listed in any HOA financial documents, was not registered with the state, and was controlled exclusively by Vicki Ridgeway. Gerald Park called me personally when the audit results came in. His voice sounded like a man carrying something very heavy. "Matt, the audit has identified some significant irregularities." "How significant?" "The board has voted to refer the matter to the county prosecutor's office." I sat with that for a moment. "Okay. I want you to know the board takes full responsibility for the oversight failure. We should have been monitoring this more closely. There's going to be a full governance review." The referral to the prosecutor's office happened about a week after that, and 2 weeks after that, on a Wednesday morning when the temperature was trying and failing to reach 25 degrees, Vicki Ridgeway was charged with theft by deception and misrepresentation of authority. The theft charge related to the $2,200 diverted to the unauthorized account. The misrepresentation charge related to the systematic use of a fabricated title to collect funds. She resigned from the HOA board the same day the charges were filed, which made the whole situation slightly anticlimactic but also deeply satisfying in its completeness. The police were professional and quiet about the whole thing. There were no squad cars with lights flashing outside her corner house, no dramatic moment of handcuffs on the pristine driveway. She was asked to come in. She went in. She was processed. She posted bail and she went home. But the charges were real and the case moved forward. The neighborhood, naturally, talked about it at great length. There was the expected range of reactions. Some people were genuinely shocked, because Vicki had always maintained a veneer of polished community concern that made her seem, on the surface, like someone who genuinely cared. Other people, particularly those who had lived in Maplecrest Heights for a long time, nodded slowly and said some version of they always knew something was off. Dave Kowalski sent me a text that said only 3 fire emojis and a thumbs up, which I thought was perfect. There was also a community meeting, a real one this time with the full board and open participation, to discuss governance reforms. Gerald organized it and ran it, and it was the most attended HOA meeting in Maplecrest Heights history. Linda, who had been a paralegal for 30 years and understood these documents better than anyone, agreed to serve on a temporary governance committee to review the CC&Rs and tighten up the language around enforcement authority, committee creation, and financial controls. Randy joined her on that committee. Even Dave, who had sworn off HOA involvement years ago, showed up to 2 of the committee's working sessions and contributed more sensible suggestions per hour than anyone else in the room. The refund process for fines collected under the void notices moved forward through the HOA's insurance and general fund. It wasn't fast. It wasn't perfectly smooth. But within about 2 months, every homeowner who had paid a fine under the unauthorized title and filed a refund request had received their money back. I got mine, and the amount was exactly right, which I had honestly not fully expected. The separate matter of the diverted $2,200 was handled through the criminal process, and as part of the resolution of the charges against Vicki, that amount was ordered to be restored to the HOA general fund. I ran into Gerald in the parking lot of the grocery store in early February, on a gray, cold day when everything outside was the color of old snow and exhaust. He was loading bags into his car and looked up when I said his name. "How are things going on the board?" I asked. "Quieter," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor and not quite tiredness but somewhere between them. Significantly quieter. I told him I thought he had handled the whole situation with real professionalism, and he shrugged and said that the board should have caught it years earlier, and that was something the board had to live with. "You caught it when it was brought to your attention," I said. "That counts for something." He nodded and loaded the last bag and closed his trunk and said, "Your pipe wrap is still there, I noticed." "Yep. Doing its job." "Good," he said. "It's going to be cold through March." He was right about that. It stayed cold through March and the pipe wrap did its job every single day. The back water line never froze, never burst, never caused me any trouble at all. Every now and then I'd go out to the backyard for something and I'd glance at it and feel a specific small satisfaction that is hard to explain to someone who hasn't been through a $2,000 pipe repair, and then a 4-month HOA battle over the thing that was preventing the next one. The HOA annual meeting in March was also unlike any meeting Maplecrest Heights had seen in years. There were board elections. Gerald Park was re-elected, which everyone agreed was appropriate because he had done the right thing. Patricia was re-elected. 2 new members were elected, including Linda Foss, who ran after significant encouragement from basically the entire street and won easily. The new board, in their first official meeting, voted to formalize several governance changes that the Reform Committee had recommended. No new committee titles could be created without a full board vote. No enforcement actions resulting in financial penalties could be taken without documentation reviewed and co-signed by 2 board members. All fine collection would go through a single verified account with monthly reporting to the full board. And a new homeowner liaison position was created, a real one this time, properly voted on and documented, to serve as a point of contact for homeowners with concerns before formal enforcement processes were triggered. Linda, being Linda, wrote up a 2-page summary of the changes and mailed a copy to every homeowner in the neighborhood. She also posted it to the neighborhood's online group, where it received more engagement than anything that had been posted there in years, mostly in the form of comments that ranged from "finally" to "honestly about time" to "I cannot believe I paid that bird bath fine." Vicki's case moved through the court system in the spring. She ultimately entered a plea agreement on a reduced version of the theft charge, was sentenced to a modest fine and community service, and avoided jail time. The misrepresentation charge was resolved as part of the same agreement. It wasn't the most dramatic legal outcome, but it was a real one. Her name was attached to real charges, the money was restored, and the record of what happened existed in the public court documents for anyone who ever wanted to look it up. People in the neighborhood noted, with quiet satisfaction, that the house on the corner was a lot quieter these days. The clipboard was gone. The slow walks past other people's houses were gone. The orange notices with the bold print were gone. I thought about all of it sometimes in those early spring weeks when the weather was still cold enough to keep the heat tape on, but the days were getting longer, and the snow was starting to thin at the edges of the driveway. I thought about the 9-degree morning when I found the notice on my door, and I thought about the kitchen full of neighbors and coffee and CC&Rs. And I thought about Linda on her laptop pulling board meeting minutes while outside the temperature tried to kill every exposed pipe in the neighborhood. There's something that happens in a community when people who have been quietly frustrated by the same thing finally have a reason to talk to each other about it. We had known each other, the people on my street, for years. We waved from driveways. We said hello at the mailbox. We helped dig each other out after big snowfalls because that's what people do. But we hadn't really talked, hadn't really compared notes or shared information or had any kind of coordinated understanding of what was happening to all of us. Vicki's headlamp notices changed that. I don't want to give her credit for improving our community because that would be strange given the circumstances. But the result of all of it was that we were a more connected group of neighbors afterward than we had been before. Dave and I had dinner at Randy and Carol's house in late March, after the worst of the winter was finished, and we spent about 2 hours around their kitchen table eating Carol's excellent chili and talking about absolutely nothing related to the HOA, which felt like its own kind of victory. The pipe wrap came off in May when I was confident the risk of freezing had passed. I coiled it up neatly and put it in the garage, ready for next October. The pipe underneath was in perfect shape. Not a crack, not a stress point, not a hint of damage. The foam insulation had done its job, the heat tape had done its job, and the waterproof wrap that had sparked all of this had done its job too. I stood in the backyard on a May morning that was still crisp but heading toward warmth, holding a coil of gray insulation wrap, thinking about a woman in a puffy vest and a headlamp standing in the dark at 6 in the morning in 9-degree weather, taping orange notices to people's doors. I thought about how certain she must have been that she was the authority, that her title meant something, that the clipboard gave her power over other people's choices in their own homes. And I thought about how completely wrong she was about every single one of those things, and how satisfying it had been to demonstrate that, not with anger or drama, but with the actual text of the documents, the actual records, the actual phone calls and letters and meetings and audits. Being right is useful. Being right with documentation is better. Being right with documentation and a retired paralegal neighbor is basically unbeatable. I put the pipe wrap on the shelf in the garage next to a spare roll of heat tape and a can of spray foam sealant, all of it ready for when winter came back around, which it always does. The neighborhood was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from fear or compliance, but the kind that comes from things being settled, from things actually being right. The HOA existed because the HOA was part of how the neighborhood organized itself, but it was now an HOA that had real accountability and real oversight and real people who were paying attention. Linda made sure of that. Gerald made sure of that. The rest of us made sure of that by showing up. My outdoor heated water line wrap was not an approved material according to Vicki Ridgeway. It turned out everything else she had decided about her own authority wasn't approved either. And that, in the end, was the thing that made all the difference. I filed the refund check in my folder with the CC&Rs and the response letter and the photos and all of it, because sometimes you just want to keep a record of a thing that went right. Not because you're proud of having fought, but because you want to remember that fighting back with facts and patience and good neighbors actually works. That it's worth reading the documents. That it's worth writing the letter. That 9 degrees and a fake title, and a woman with a headlamp and a clipboard can set off a chain of events that ends with real accountability and a community that's genuinely better off. The snow came back the following January, same as it always does in this part of the country, and I wrapped the pipe in October like I said I would, and it looked exactly the same as it did the year before, gray and practical and doing its job on the back wall of my house. Nobody said a word about it, not one single word, and that was perfect.